Today, I'm going to talk about how I set up a Nikon camera for landscape photography, and I'm going to demonstrate on the new Nikon Z5 II. So I recently purchased the Nikon Z5 II as an upgrade to my Nikon Z6 II. Regular followers of the channel will know I'm a huge fan of the Nikon Z7 II for landscape photography, and that is still my main camera for my landscape photography. But I do carry a second camera into the field, sort of as a backup or a secondary, and that's always been a Nikon Z6 II. And while that camera served me well, when the Nikon Z5 II came out, it has the faster processor, has a couple features in it that I thought, it might make a good secondary body for my normal carry into the field. So that's why I picked it up. And a topic that's been on my list for quite a while to do has been how I set up a Nikon camera for my landscape photography. And I thought with this new camera, this would be a great time to sit down, make this video as I go over what settings I change sort of from the defaults to how I like it for landscape photography, as well as I'm going to touch on how I configure the quick menu, which is a super valuable tool for Nikon photographers to get those settings nice and close. And I do have a couple custom buttons I changed just to change things around as well. And while I'm going to demonstrate this on the Nikon Z5 II, because I like my cameras to be as similar as possible as far as whereas I have things mapped to, the buttons be the same, the menus be the same, even though I'm demonstrating on the Nikon Z5 II, this is very representative of how I have my Nikon Z7 II set up and my Z6 II in the past. So I thought this would be the perfect time to do this video. So let's dive into it. Now we're going to start this by working through the menus in the camera and start changing things that I would normally change. Now I'm not going to change every single setting here in this menu. If it's something I don't change, we're just going to sort of skip on by it. When I change it, I'll just give a brief explanation as to why. Some of the things I changed, I've done more in-depth videos on, and I will link to those videos down below. So if you want to see, well, why are you changing that? Or what do you do with that? It'll probably be down in the description below for your reference to sort of dive deeper into why I might be changing that setting. So I'm not going to talk about every single setting, but I will focus on the ones that I do change, and we'll move through the menus of the camera starting from the top and moving our way down. Once I get through configuring these basic settings in the camera menus, then I am going to talk about the quick menu, the I menu on the Nikon, how I set it up, and I'll go through each one of those buttons and talk a little bit about what I put in that place and why I have it there. And then finally, we'll conclude with a couple of the buttons on the camera that I do remap to special functions. Again, just touch a little bit about why I do it that way and go from there. Now, one thing to keep in mind as I get set to dive in here, this is how I configure my camera today. This does change over time. It evolves a little bit. Small changes here, small changes there. Maybe because I've learned something new or a different approach that I make a setting change to suit my style. With that said, this is pretty representative of how I set up my cameras, and I've only been doing small tweaks over time. For example, in the quick menu, focus shift shooting, I used not to have that in that menu, and I had it in a custom My menu, and I found it's just so much easier to put in the quick menu. And that was a change I made just recently within the past couple of months. So with that, let's dive into the menus here. So first, let's take a look here. We'll hit the menu button on the back of the camera. We're going to start at the photo shooting menu, which is the first option here on the Nikon Z5 II. And like I said, you can reset all of your settings here right at the top. I leave my storage folder the same. I see no reason to change that. File naming, I don't change that either. Now, the role played by the card in slot 2, this is a dual slot camera. I'm a big fan of a dual slot camera. Right now it's set to overflow, so it would fill the first card, then go to the second card. Well, I always change that to backup because I prefer to have that second card be a backup to the primary card. So I always change that. Image area, I don't change. Tone mode, I don't change. Now, image quality. Image quality is where I'm going to change it to photograph in RAW. I always photograph in RAW. I don't do the RAW plus JPEG. It's an option if you're new to photographing in RAW, and that could be the way you want to go. But I'm going to set it to RAW, and again, that's a setting I really don't change a whole lot. Continue on through, don't really mess with these settings. ISO sensitivity settings, we change. I do change, but I do it through the buttons and the controls, and I don't really always come in here to change it, so I don't really change it as my default setting. White balance, similar, you can change it in other places, but I am going to go ahead and change it here just so I don't forget if I were out in the field. And I typically set it to direct sunlight. I like to shoot with a set white balance. Sometimes I'll set it to 5600, sometimes I'll set it to daylight. In this particular case, I'm setting it to daylight. It's what I do more and more often just because it saves me from jumping into the Kelvin menu and changing things around. So I do set that. You can change it later, but that's where I set that. Picture control, just set it to SD, manage picture control, and nothing there. Color space, this is the gamut of colors that the camera is taking. I do set this to Adobe RGB, just gives me more color bits to work with, a little bit more subtle variations in the photo so that when I get it into post-processing, I have options available to me just during that. Not a huge deal, but I do set it to Adobe RGB. Moving on down the list, I don't really mess with these much at all. Sort of leave these to the defaults. The Z5 II has several skin softening portrait options. I don't mess with those because I'm not shooting portraits with this. Metering mode, it does default to matrix metering. And while I don't change it from that, it is just something a lot of people ask, what metering mode do you use? I use matrix metering. It's evaluative metering in Canons. I think Sony might call it the same thing, but this is where how it's using the light meter and everything like that. It's looking at the whole scene and not center weighting it or anything like that. I've done past videos on metering modes, but I do leave it to matrix metering. And though I'm not changing it, I get enough questions on it. I think it's worth calling out. Flash mode, not using a flash, so I don't need to worry about any of that. Release mode, I actually put into a quick menu. I leave it set to single in some cases. Some I do continuous if I'm shooting wildlife or handheld, but I default to single. And then coming down to focus mode, I do set it to single AF, so it gets its focus and then it keeps it at that. So I do set it to that. And in AF area mode, it defaults to a large area, auto area AF. I do like to set it to single point AF, just because I like to be able to put my autofocus right on a particular area I want to focus on and set the focus there. So I do change that as well. Don't change any of these options. Vibration reduction, I leave on, though I put it in a quick menu in case I need to turn it off somewhere. Auto bracketing gets put in a quick menu for configuration on the fly. Multiple exposure off, none of the interval. Focus shift shooting, we're gonna go ahead and jump in here and change some of the options. I end up putting this in a quick menu, I mentioned that earlier, but here I do set my number of shots down to 30. Now for Nikon, this is just the maximum number of shots it'll take, but I tend to set that to 30 and I set my step width down to 2. And those are really the major changes I make to it. Again, focus shift shooting, I've done a full video on this, and this is Nikon's automated version of focus stacking. So you can come in here, you can kick off a focus shift shooting mode, and it's going to take up to 30 images at a focus step width of 2. But those are just the defaults I set for this particular mode. Now, pixel shift shooting is something new to me in the Nikon world. I've used it in other camera systems, and I wasn't sure the Nikon Z5 II came with it because some of the online articles said, yes, it has it. Some of them didn't mention it, so I wasn't sure. It does indeed have it, and I'm not going to change anything with it right now because I need to play with it more, and I'm not really comfortable making recommendations on it, but I'm excited to see this mode, and I probably will do a future video on this particular mode, and I am going to put it in my quick menu because I think it could be handy. And that's really it for the shooting menu. That takes us all the way through it. So let's go to the next menu. The next one down is video. And while I do video with my cameras, and I do plan on doing some video with this camera because a YouTuber, you know, it should work well for that. I'll do a little bit of video. I'm gonna skip it for the purpose of this video because I'm really trying to focus on landscape photographers doing still photography and not really trying to get into the video side of the world. So we're gonna skip the video menu and move on to the custom settings menu. And the custom settings menu can be quite overwhelming. There's a whole lot of options in here, but there's really only a few things that I go in and change. First one is under focus. We'll bounce into the focus menu, and I keep most of these the same, but what I do want to go down to is AF activation. I've talked about back button focus in the past. I have a video, it'll be linked down below, but back button focus is where you focus by using the AF on button and not half pressing the shutter. In the back button focus video that I'll link below, I talk all more about it, but this is a setting I change. I go into AF activation, and I'm essentially changing it so it doesn't try to focus when I half press the shutter and only focuses when I press the AF on button, back button focus. So I do change that. And then just because it's annoying, I turn off the built-in AF assist eliminator, turn it off. That's what puts a little light on. If you're in a dark room trying to focus on a person or something like that in a room, it's handy. But with landscapes, when really what I'm trying to focus on is probably 100 plus yards away in a lot of cases, that eliminator doesn't do anything but annoyingly light up on my camera. So I do turn that setting off. And that's the most of what I change in this menu. Sometimes I'll drift in here and change something else, For the most part though, I leave it like that. We're gonna come back to controls. I do change controls. This is where we would come to change the quick menu in here, but we will come back to that. Same with configuring the buttons. We'll come back in to change that as well. Okay, so from the custom settings menu, then we're gonna dive into the display, the playback menu, and let's take a look at there. There's just a couple things I change here. First, down at the playback display options, I like to go in and enable the focus point. So this is, I take my picture and look at my review images. I like to have the focus point shown, and then I like to do the highlights and RGB histogram. Highlights will get me the zebra stripes and playback, so if I've overexposed something, I'll get the blinkies. And then the RGB histogram is, while I'm using my histogram on the back of the camera, I can also use it in playback mode just to sort of make sure I'm getting everything in. And RGB, of course, is going to give me the red, green, blue version of it, so I can keep a look at each of those colors. And then I also turn picture review off. Now it defaults to that, so it's not really a setting change to make, but because I've seen people do this with their focus stacking or their exposure bracketing, if you have picture review on, each time you take a picture, it shows you the review. And it can just get annoying, especially if you're trying to do touch focus stacking and work your way through where you are doing a manual focus stack and you tap the back of the screen, get it to focus and take the picture and move on through. If you have the picture review on, that just sort of pops up and gets in the way. So I like to make sure picture review is off, and so by default, this camera has it off, but I like to make sure. Then we'll bounce out of the playback menu. We'll go down to the normal setup menu. This is where you do your typical things like format memory cards, everything like that. This is also where you can set up your U1, your U2, U3, which are your custom user settings on the camera. I have a full video on this, which I'll link to below, so I'm not going to dive in and do all of this saving, but I do just want to touch on what I would use it for. So U1, I would put my typical landscape photography settings in there, like sort of where I like to start my defaults at, which would normally be, since I'm shooting on a tripod, I'd have IBIS turned off. I would probably have my aperture set to around f8, my ISO set to ISO 100, a shutter speed of 1/30th or 1/60th. So that way, anytime I went to U1, it puts me right there. Then U2, I tend to do for handheld photography. So I'm changing things like my ISO, kicking it up a little bit to like 400, getting my shutter speed up a little bit, probably lowering my aperture just a little bit to something like f5.6, f4, something like that. Oh, and I'd turn image stabilization back on. That way, if I'm popping off of my tripod, I can switch to U2 and sort of be where I want. And finally, U3, I tend to make my wildlife setting, which is where I tend to be bringing the aperture down as low as I can. Most cases for me with the lenses I have, it's gonna be around f4, f5.6. And I set my ISO to auto ISO so that I'm more quickly able to move. I'll set my focus points to be more dynamic as opposed to single point focus, more continuous. All those types of things. I cover it all in the video where I talk about setting up the custom controls, but that's where you do it, is there in the save user settings. You would just configure it, you'd save it to U1, you'd save it to U2, you'd save it to U3, and so on. That's what I would do there. Of course, then you want to be sure to set your time and date. This one has had it set, but when the camera comes straight from the factory, it's not set to the correct thing. But you want to come in here and set this. That's where you do it right here. Monitor brightness comes in at 0. You do want to be aware of monitor brightness. I usually set mine to 0 or -1 because I don't want it to look too bright. Sometimes it can be deceptive and you're looking at the back of your camera. And if you're not paying close attention to the histogram or the light meter, you might think things are properly exposed or something like that. So this is where you change your monitor brightness. I'm usually a 0 or -1 person. Sometimes if it's really, really bright, I will consciously crank it up, and I would just come into the menu to do that. And then finally, camera sounds should be down here. Camera sounds is down here at the bottom. It defaults to off, which I think is a good thing because I don't like those little beeps and clicks and all that kind of stuff. So, but I usually make sure it's off. So that's where it's at. And then finally, we're getting near the end here. The network menu, I don't really change anything here. It's very specific if you would. My defaults are not changing. Not to say you'll never come into this menu, but by default, I don't really set anything up in it. And finally, over here on the left, you've got my menu. And this is a custom menu. This is if you've got a couple things that you access fairly frequently. Maybe they don't warrant a spot in the quick menu. You can put them in here. The biggest thing I used to put in this menu is focus shift shooting, because it would let me just click in the menu, arrow up once, get into my menu, and kick off a focus shift for that focus stacking. But since I've moved it to my quick menu, I don't even put it in here. So, but this is handy for those handful settings you might want to change. Real handy maybe if you switch between landscape photography and portrait photography and you're making a few more setting changes, you could put them in here in the my menu. But these days, since I've moved focus shift shooting, I don't really use my menu a whole lot, but it's there if you need it and can be handy. So that's how I work through the main menu. Those are essentially my defaults. Several of these settings that we talked about, I put my quick menu and R settings that I change more frequently. So let's take a look at that quick menu, the I menu on the Nikon camera. Okay, so that brings us to the quick menu, or the I menu as they call it on the Nikon camera. On the back of the Nikon camera, there is an I button, and when you press that, it pops up a menu on the back of your display so that you can get quick access to settings that you might frequently change. I make heavy use of that menu, so let's dive into how I configure it on my cameras. So first, to configure it, you hit menu on the back of your camera, and you go down to the custom settings menu, and then you arrow over and go down to the controls menu. You click OK to get into that. And then you can customize the I menu. So this is how it comes by default. I'm going to walk through how I change things. We're going to work through the upper row first and then the lower row. We're going to work from left to right in both cases. Where I start is in this first spot. To change one of these, once the spot you want to change is highlighted, you can just press the OK button, and now you can map it to something else. So for this upper spot, left-hand side, we're going to set this to exposure delay mode. And exposure delay mode is where when I press the shutter, it waits 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds to actually take the picture. It lets the vibration fade away and helps keep your camera nice and still. So we're going to put exposure delay mode there. I highlighted it, clicked OK, and it put it in that spot. And that's just a setting I like to have very quickly available to me, so I put it in this menu. Next up, we're going to map this one to exposure, automated exposure bracketing. So we're going to scroll through here, find exposure bracketing, auto bracketing. This is so that if I want to do automatic exposure brackets, it's super easy. I can just come in here, click the menu, and I can change my exposure bracketing settings. Next over, we're going to do focus shift shooting. This is the new one I added in here. I didn't used to have it here. Again, this is how Nikon automatic focus stacks. And I find it super handy to have it right here because I can just press I, hit my focus shift shooting, and kick off that series. So super helpful. I like to have it there. Next one is choose image area. And then we're going to choose image area. And this is where I can choose whether it's going to be 2, 3, 16 by 9. Now this is sort of a flex spot for me. I don't change this much because of how Nikon handles changing this. It actually deletes and actually crops the pixels in camera, which I don't like. So this is sort of a flex spot. If I ever found a setting that I think was more valuable, this would be one of the ones I would replace. But I stick it in here just in case I ever want to change it on the fly. Next up, we do release mode, which just lets me change it from single shot, continuous, or add a self timer. Real handy if I'm doing tripod photography, I'll tend to have single shot. But if I'm doing handheld, sometimes I'll want to put it on continuous, or maybe I'm doing wildlife. This makes it super easy for me to change that on the fly. So I put release mode on there. Self-timer is handy too if you're out wanting to take a group photo. It's right there at your fingertips. And then AF area mode. Just come in here, and this is what would let me choose single point focus, which is what I typically want to do, but I like to have it nice and close right there in case I need it. So that's what I do for my top row. Moving on to the bottom row, left-hand side again. I do put my white balance here. I talked earlier, I tend to set it to daylight, which is what I have it set to. I tend to leave it at that, but every once in a while, you just want to see, maybe set it to the cloudy to get a warmer feel in your picture, just to see what it would look like. So I do put it on there. So I set my white balance down there. I don't use it a lot, but I do find it sort of handy to have there. This is a new one I've put in here. This is the pixel shift shooting. Haven't had a chance to actually use it, but I do feel like it's going to be one that I want to use frequently. Pixel shift shooting is where when you're on a tripod nice and still, you take the picture and the center does a little bit of a pixel shift. It lets you get a much higher resolution photo than this camera is capable of with a single shot. It's something I've played with on some Lumix cameras. I liked it. I thought it was cool, and I feel like this is something that would be useful to have quick access to, so I don't have to go dig through the menus to find it. We'll do a video on pixel shift shooting and how it works on this Nikon in more detail, but for now, just know I am mapping it to the quick menu because I think it'll be used more frequently if I'm able to get to it easily. Metering mode, I do set it here. I don't really change it off of matrix metering very often, so to me, I consider this sort of a flex spot, meaning that if I came up with something that I thought was more valuable here, I would readily replace this. But again, matrix metering, this is where the camera's looking at the whole scene to judge how it's going to use the light meter, as opposed to just like center weighted or single point. So I do set my metering mode there. Like I said, sort of a flex spot. It wouldn't take a whole lot to convince me that there's something better suited there. But for now, it's home to metering mode options. The next one is also a flex spot. It is picture control. Really, I just haven't come up with something better that could really be anything at this point in time. Let's find it here. Set picture control. Flex spot. It's another one that I could easily replace probably with something more valuable when I come up with something I think is more valuable. Vibration control. This is a big one. This one is important. There are enough times I change this. I like to have vibration control right there. Often, if I'm shooting with a telephoto lens on a tripod or something like that, I'll want to turn vibration control off. Otherwise, it does this weird little panning thing when you're trying to take a picture all zoomed out. You'll try to get your composition and it'll just drift. So I put vibration reduction so I can easily turn it off and on right there. And then finally, focus mode, whether I'm doing single or continuous. Most often I'm shooting single, but if I'm shooting some wildlife or something like that where it's moving, then I'll put it on continuous. And I do like to have that easily able to change. So I stick to focus mode there. So that's really how I set up my eye menu. Like I said, I do have a couple of those flex spots. In fact, if you've got an idea of what I should be using from those flex spots, I sort of have 2.5 flex spots that I could swap out. So if you have something really cool mapped in this quick menu that you think I'm overlooking, or like, why did you not put that there? This is so important. I'd love to hear about it down in the comments below. Just drop it down there and maybe I'll find something else for one of those flex spots. But that's how you configure the eye menu on the Nikon. Super handy. Do take the time to configure it because it'll just make your life easier and more efficient in the field. And then we get to the physical button controls. I do remap the function 1 button, which used to be the only one I mapped. We'll talk about why I'm doing a function 2 now, but the function buttons are on the front of the camera. And the one I really like to have there, again, you customize this by going to the custom settings menu, going to the controls portion, then down to custom controls shooting. And this talks about all the different buttons you can map. It defaults to function 1. This is the one I always remap, and I remap it to exposure delay. I love to use exposure delay, but it's really nice to have quick access to either turn it on or turn it off if you're moving from a tripod to handheld. Being able to have quick access, I can actually do this while I'm holding the camera, press the button and change it from 2 seconds. I normally have it set to 0, or if I'm going back on a tripod, it's real easy to change it from 0 back to 2 seconds. So exposure delay gets mapped to my function 1 button. Super handy. The other thing on the Nikon Z5 II is it has starlight mode, starlight view mode, which lets you have better autofocus, better visibility for composition, and low light scenes. So be thinking pre-dawn, post-sunset, when it's dim out, maybe your camera's hunting for focus. Haven't had a chance to play with this, but I've seen a person in a workshop with a Z8 sort of show me what it looked like, and I'm really excited about this mode, but I need a way to be able to turn it off and on very quickly. So I am going to map my function 2 button, also on the front of the camera, labeled function 2, to starlight mode. So to do that, I'm just back here in the custom controls menu for shooting, and I'm going to highlight function 2, press that, and I'm going to scroll through, look for starlight mode, and look for starlight. Still looking. As you can see, you can set all sorts of different things here. Starlight view, so I'm going to set it to that. So now when I'm out in the field, if I want to get access to that starlight view, I don't have to go dig through a whole bunch of menus to go find it. I can just press function 2 and it will enable starlight mode. When I'm done, if I don't want it anymore, I can press it again and it'll remove starlight mode. So those are really the only 2 button things I remap. Other than that, I'm pretty good with the defaults, but those are the 2 that I reconfigure. So those are the settings I make on a Nikon camera to get it all ready for landscape photography. While I demonstrate this on the Nikon Z5 II, it is very, very similar to my Nikon Z7 II and my Nikon Z6 II that I've used in the past in order to be able to have fast, efficient access to these settings. I make some default setting changes in the main menus, which we worked through. Then I set up my quick menu, the eye menu, so that those things I use more frequently are right at my fingertips. And then I have a button or 2 that I configure as well to make it just easier to use in the field. And beyond that, I try to match it across all my cameras so that they're very, very similar. So I can pretty much grab any one out of the bag and know where things are at when I start using it in the field. So hopefully this video was helpful, lets you see sort of my approach to the settings that I go out with by default in the field, what I like to have quick access to, and hopefully it'll make you more efficient with your landscape photography in the field. Now for several of these options I have more in-depth videos about, which I'll link to what I think might be more popular right here. And in anything that's not linked here, I will have linked down in the description. So be sure to check those out, and thank you for watching.